Thanks for joining us for Bracing for Campus Carry in the Lone Star State. My name is Jenny Lacoste-Caputo. I'm the head of the Public Affairs Department at the University of Texas System, so this is something that I've been paying very close attention to over the last year. Beginning August 1st of this year, concealed carry license holders in the state of Texas will be allowed to carry handguns on public university campuses. This is something that's come up in past legislative sessions only to be defeated, but in 2015, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 11, sponsored by Senator Brian Birdwell. Despite the fact that nearly every chancellor and president at public universities were opposed to the bill. There was a time, those of you that followed this probably know about this, near the end of the session, that it looked like the bill was not going to pass, but some last-minute brokering brought it back to life with a few key caveats. Private universities are allowed to opt out of the bill, and so far I believe all that have made their public announcements. And the second key caveat is that university presidents would be able to establish rules on where handguns are carried and how they're stored, though the rules must ensure that the campuses are as, quote, permissive and accessible as possible, and that universities are as specific and minimalistic as possible in defining those restricted areas. Texas is now one of 9 states that allow carrying of concealed weapons, but really this law is unique in that key caveat that presidents can design their own rules. So it's made for a very interesting implementation process, which is what we're going to talk about. At the University of Texas System, that process has been led by our Deputy Chancellor, Dr. David Daniel, here to my left. Dr. Daniel was appointed Deputy Chancellor in July of last year, so just in time for the fun. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in engineering from UT Austin. He served on the faculty at UT Austin from 1980 to 1996. He then moved to the University of Illinois, serving first as the head of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and from 2001 to 2005 as Dean of Engineering. Dr. Daniel was appointed president of the University of Texas at Dallas in 2005 and served in that role for a decade. Next to Dr. Daniel, we have Stephen Good. Stephen was able to serve as the chair of UT Austin's Campus Carry Policy Working Group, so really represented his university in that beginning implementation process. He's a professor of law at UT Law School. He practiced law with the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. before joining the UT faculty in 1977. I know he looks like he must have been a child at that time, but... I was. He's the author of several books on the law of evidence and served as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs of the Law School from 1998 to 2006, and as Dean ad interim in 2006. And next to Stephen, we have Dr. Fernando Gomez. Dr. Gomez has served as Vice Chancellor and General Counsel for the Texas State University System for more than 20 years. Dr. Gomez earned his bachelor's degree from the University of New Mexico, his law and doctorate degrees from the University of Michigan. He was a tenured professor at Michigan State before serving as Assistant Attorney General in Michigan and in Texas, and as General Counsel for the California State University System. So first I wanted to open it up. David, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about take us back to the beginning of the legislative session, 2015, and really what was the discussion among presidents? You were still a president at that time, and chancellors when you were talking about this upcoming legislation.
Well, thanks, first of all, for the opportunity to be here. As with the general population, I think that most of the presidents of public universities in Texas were not in favor of concealed carry, but there probably were a few who were in favor of concealed carry by license holders in the state of Texas. I found it interesting that few legislators had much interest in what we, university presidents, actually thought of the issue, because I think they were grounded in beliefs about fundamental principles and rights of licensed individuals to carry concealed weapons. We would have preferred, or at least I would have preferred, that individual campuses be given the opportunity to opt out, as private universities have, but that was not what the legislation said. Finally, the law indeed was passed, and critically important, it does allow university presidents to establish reasonable rules taking into account the unique characteristics of each campus. The law does require university presidents in establishing those reasonable rules to consult with students, faculty, and staff. So following the implementation of the law, the first task was to have that consultation, and Professor Good chaired that group at the University of Texas at Austin, and my other colleague spearheaded the effort at Texas State, but there was a deep and collaborative process at many of our campuses, although I have to say at some of the institutions, especially the rural institutions, this was not nearly so much of a big deal as it was at UT Austin. So that's a quick rundown on the history, and now we have the law which goes into effect August 1. I do want to emphasize, it is only applicable to licensed concealed handgun holders of licenses, which means you have to be 21 years old and meet some other standards. It does not apply to open carry.
Professor Good, what about the faculty? Was there a lot of discussion on campus during the legislative session? It seems like faculty have been very vocal lately, but I think some people feel like there were a few key people that were really out there hanging in the wind during the legislative session.
The faculty didn't, I think it's fair to say, did not pay a lot of attention to the issue while it was in the legislature. The faculty was certainly aware that it was roiling in the legislature. They were also aware that the president of the university and the chancellor had spoken out against it. And I think a lot of the faculty had much the same impression that Chancellor Daniel has just alluded to. That is, even if the faculty had rallied, that would not have had a lot of impact on the legislature. I think it's our impression at the University of Texas that the Texas legislature is not really cowed by a rally of English professors at the University of Texas.
And Professor Good and Dr. Gomez, maybe from a legal standpoint, I alluded to this in the intro, but can we talk a little bit about how the Texas law really is unique? We're the 9th state in the country, but there's some very unique things about this law.
Well, the campus carry, one point I want to make is that the issue of weapons on campus has been dealt with in any number of states, but in Texas, for about 20 years, we have had a law on the books that says that an individual carrying with a concealed handgun license, carrying a weapon on campus, can carry it on the grounds of the campus and cannot be arrested or prosecuted for a crime. Now, during those same 20 years, virtually all of higher education in Texas, both public and private, have had an administrative policy or administrative policies that made it punishable to carry a concealed weapon. So even though somebody could not be punished under the criminal code, a person could be terminated, or if a student could be disciplined for carrying weapons on the campus. So this is an issue that has been before the legislature, I think, for quite some period of time. In recent years, I think maybe 2 or 3 sessions in which the legislature attempted to pass this same campus carry bill, and this time around they finally had sufficient votes to tell the campuses, no, we're not going to permit you to punish somebody administratively for having carried a weapon on the campus. So the Texas state system, which consists of basically 7 institutions on probably about 14 campuses throughout the state, about 85,000 students, has been dealing with this in the same fashion as the University of Texas system, which did a marvelous job with their policies and the handling of public relations. But we've been dealing with it as well since late March, early April of this year, which is when our first awareness came that this time it was different and that these campuses, this bill had a chance of passing. So
Speaking of public relations, this caveat in the law that makes it different, that allows presidents to create these rules, has really put a lot of responsibility and onus on the presidents, and I think they've been receiving a lot of the criticism because of that. Dr. Daniel, or any of you want to jump in, you want to talk a little bit about, was it really a better move from a president standpoint to have this option, or did it make the whole process more difficult?
Well, I would just say it did make the process more difficult, but this was absolutely the right thing to do. Our campuses are very different from one another. University presidents are used to taking heat. That's not a big deal at all. It is, in fact, their responsibility and obligation to do the very best they can, not only for the safety of the campus, but the education and training of students as well. So while it did, I think, put presidents in some cases, and Professor Good can talk about that at Austin, I think that was probably front and center of the issue. But I've talked with presidents who, with one meeting, would hear from a faculty member adamantly opposed to concealed carry, and the next appointment was with a faculty member adamantly in favor of concealed carry. But presidents all the time have to balance these responsibilities and obligations, and I think they have done so masterfully. But I think, UT Austin probably got more attention than anyone else, and President Fenves more attention than any other president, and you were right there the whole time, Stephen.
I think that's fair to say about President Fenves. The Texas law really is unique. If you look at the other states' laws, the presidents of the universities are given no discretion. Some of the other states' laws have a couple of places that may be off limits to handguns, but other than that, handguns are allowed every place on campus in these other states, whereas in Texas, the presidents were given the right to make reasonable rules and regulations. It has been very controversial at the University of Texas at Austin. President Fenves took office at the beginning of last summer, and the very first issue he had to confront was we had some Confederate statues on our campus. And it was right around the time of the shooting in Charleston when this issue flared up. And he took office and immediately had to deal with that. And at one point, I ran into him this fall, and I said, "Don't you just wish for the good old days when all you had to deal with was Confederate statues on campus?" And that really was an easy issue. Just to give you an idea of the level of attention, we received over 3,300 online comments to our website. We had 2 public forums. We streamed them. We posted them. The second of our public forums had 32,000 views. We received statements from dozens and dozens of departments, professional organizations around the country. 1,700 of our professors signed a petition. It was an extremely controversial issue. And I would say overall, between 70 and 75% of the comments we received were anti-campus carry, and only about a quarter were in favor of campus carry. And so it has been a very difficult issue, and President Fenves has received lots and lots of comments from students, faculty, staff, but parents and alumni as well.
And losing faculty was a concern. It was a concern Chancellor McRaven mentioned during the legislative session, that it could be a recruitment problem, and UT Austin is losing a high-profile faculty member who said in part that factored into his decision. Is that a concern among faculty as well? And then Dr. Daniel, from a recruitment standpoint, from an administrator's perspective?
I would say at the University of Texas, it certainly is a recruitment issue. Both students and faculty. And I think part of it is that this issue feeds into a larger narrative about the state of Texas that is out there in the country. I was asked just a couple of weeks ago to go up to Syracuse and to talk about this issue, and the person from Syracuse sent me an email and was discussing what we might want to talk about, and he said, Texas, of course, is the gun-totingest state in the country. And I pointed out to him that actually we're only about the 20th gun-totingest state in the country. There are a lot of places where there's a lot more guns than there are in Texas, and Texas is a much more urban state than many other places. But it fits the narrative that people in the Northeast and the West Coast have. And that's where we draw a lot of our faculty from and where we recruit a lot of our students from. And so I think the campus carry has a magnified impact because it fits into this larger narrative about Texas.
How do you counter that, Dr. Daniel, from a recruitment standpoint?
Well, I'll put my marketing hat on. So we just recruited as my replacement at the University of Texas at Dallas, Dr. Richard Benson, who is the Dean of Engineering at Virginia Tech. It was in his building that the tragic Virginia Tech shootings occurred. And he's made it clear that he would prefer that there not be any guns on campus. He had to live through the trauma. He and his wife, Leslie, had to go to all the funerals, and it's a very, very emotional event for him. But he's still coming to Texas. He realizes that on balance, when one considers where one wants to be, there are all sorts of factors to consider. And Texas is such a vibrant state, such an interesting state, such a growing state. The demographers will say, look at Texas today, and that's what the country's going to look like in 30 years. So it is, from my point of view, a liability, but nevertheless, that's counterbalanced by many, many positives. I would, one other point I think is very salient. When we say guns are allowed in a building, it's only by a licensed carrier. And it's absolutely true that the statistics show that the probability of a concealed handgun license holder committing a violent crime is dramatically lower than the population in general. And some people would argue that those concealed handgun license carriers are among the safest people out there. What is undoubtedly true is that it's a highly emotional issue. It does affect some people's thinking, probably on both sides of the issue. And our hope, I think we would all agree, is that as this law gets implemented, nothing bad happens, and we can all focus our attention on education, research, patient care, et cetera.
And would it be safe to say that at most campuses, the majority of students are under 21, so it's not a huge pool that's even eligible?
I think that's true, but Dr. Gomez, you might pick that up because you've got such a range of ages and students at your institutions.
You mean the
under 21?
Well, it's not going to have as big and will not have as big an impact as many of us thought or feared that it would have. What we've told our faculty when we started the Chancellor's Task Force in April of last year was, look, as far as whatever decisions have to be made, they've already been made. They've been made in that red granite building across the street. And so you're not going to change the direction. This is something that is going to happen. And we've kept it from happening for such a long time, for so many years, that maybe we've become accustomed to prevailing on the issue. But at this point in time, if you grasp that essential fact, and tied in with that was the concept for faculty in particular of academic freedom. And how can I teach in a classroom? How can I feel safe in teaching in a classroom when I know somebody may be carrying a weapon? To which the response is, you probably have that situation now. And there probably are people carrying weapons on the campus who are not concealed handgun holders, who are not 21, but nevertheless, this is a reality. And if you allow someone or the fear of something happening that's negative, a Virginia Tech or something along those lines, you're really allowing this situation to defeat you. And nobody's taking your academic freedom unless you choose to surrender it. The approach we took was essentially a common sense attitude toward it. We knew that some of the campuses, many of which are small town or rural, were going to embrace this. In fact, 4 of the 7 universities in our system eventually passed policies that allowed campus carry elsewhere. Now, 2 of the larger institutions, Texas State and Sam Houston, I think the reaction was largely what I think you experienced, maybe not with quite the vehemence that you experienced at the University of Texas at Austin. But I think in retrospect, as we look back in a few years or a decade or whatever it is, it may have somewhat it may evoke somewhat the response of Skylab. I don't know if you remember Skylab, the satellite that was going to fall to Earth and cause all kinds of problems. Well, it never came to be. So the approach that we've taken is just one of we're going to embrace and we're going to do what the legislature has told us to do. You're going to have input. It's not going to be determinative input, but you're going to have input. And so far, it's worked out well for us.
If I may, I think Dr. Daniel and Dr. Gomez have hit on a really important point in terms of the emotion and the fear. And one of the things that we certainly experienced at the University of Texas was the difficulty of having a rational discussion about what campus carry of concealed handguns by license holders actually involved. The numbers are quite small. We did some investigation and we discovered that we were talking about at most maybe 0.8 of 1% of our students would be license holders, much less actually carrying handguns on campus. So it's a very small number. But people, quite understandably, hear about handguns on campus and immediately leap to things like the Virginia Tech shooting or an active shooter coming into the building, which really has pretty much nothing to do with campus carry and the carrying of handguns concealed by license holders. None of the shootings on campus that have occurred have involved concealed carry license holders. But people immediately gravitate toward those and they think in those terms. And then I think also what compounds the problem is that you have 2 very different ideological approaches to this issue. So that anytime there is a shooting, both sides take it as evidence that they're right. So when we had the campus shooting in Oregon this last fall, the campus carry people all said, see, if they'd only had campus carry there, they could have shot the gunman. And the anti-campus carry people said, you see, that's why we need to stop having guns on campus and need more gun control. And so there's just this incredible difficulty in getting people to sit down and really talk in a calm and rational way about this issue, which is, of course, a very scary issue. And it's quite understandable.
You know, Stephen, I might add an example of, to build on that, of how this is not one of those issues, unlike most of them, where you can seek a compromise. I was in a town hall meeting with some students and other panelists. One was strongly pro-concealed carry. The other was totally against concealed carry. A young woman who was a student in the audience raised her hand and said she was really bothered by the law because she took an evening class and had to walk to her car after the class, and she was really concerned about the thought that there would be people on campus with guns potentially threatening her, and the anti-gun person said, I totally agree with you, ma'am, that's why we shouldn't have the law. And the pro-gun person said, well, ma'am, I have a very simple solution for you. Just get a concealed carry permit and carry a handgun in your purse, and that solves your problem. And I thought that was so characteristic of polar opposites, if you will, on the issue, and there was just no conversation about a middle ground.
And you've had the fun task of bringing those people together, or trying to. You raised the academic freedom issue and concerns of professors. And Professor Gitt, I know there's been questions at UT Austin, and I'm sure elsewhere, where professors would like to put it in their syllabus that they either wanted students to self-identify or wanted to be able to ban concealed carry in their classrooms. And can you talk a little bit about how you've worked through that and those concerns?
Well, certainly, in Texas, the law is that you're, of course, free to ask anyone if they've got a concealed handgun, but a concealed handgun license holder only has to respond if it's a law enforcement official who does the asking. And so, although a professor could theoretically ask a student, the student does not have to answer. And my view is that it's not a good question to ask, because if you ask the student and the student says yes, and you give the student a bad grade, later on the student's going to say, you're discriminating against me. Or if even the student doesn't answer and gets a bad grade, the student's going to say, you're discriminating against me, you suspected I was, that's why you gave me the bad grade.
Spoken like a lawyer.
And so I certainly hope faculty will not be asking that question. Certainly, we've heard from some faculty that they're going to put in their syllabus that people who have concealed handguns are not welcome in their class or cannot take their class. That's clearly against the law to keep people out of classes because they've got a concealed handgun with a license. And at that point, the university is going to have a response as to either clearly disassociating itself from those statements or do something in terms of the professor.
What about professors' offices?
I'm sorry?
What professors' offices, private offices? Has
We
a decision
are-
been made on that?
Yes, one of the recommendations that our working group made and that President Fenves adopted was that anyone, professor, staff person, even some students, who is the sole occupant of an office may make that a gun exclusion zone. They'll have to give oral notice to anyone. For example, a professor at the beginning of the semester can announce in the class that I don't allow guns in my office, but must be willing to make reasonable accommodations and meet someone outside the office if they want to meet outside the office.
So professors shouldn't ask a student if they are carrying a concealed weapon, but Dr. Daniel, will there be any, and Dr. Gomez as well, will there be any requirement to register, let the law enforcement on campus know if you're a concealed carry
I'll let
holder?
the attorney answer that one.
I'm sorry.
Will there be any requirement for students to register or let law enforcement on campus know if they plan to carry a concealed weapon? Or is there no oversight or tracking at all?
Well, the approach we've taken is that if they have a concealed handgun license to carry this weapon, I don't think that we can compel them to divulge. We can't compel them to go to training. We can't in any way treat them differently than we would anybody else. One of the most interesting things about this law for me is that the legislature felt so strongly about this issue that they essentially retained, I want to use a legal term, jurisdiction over the issue. Jurisdiction is nothing other than a lawyer's way of saying, or a court's way of saying, I have authority and I'm going to retain authority over the subject matter. Senator Birdwell went to the Attorney General's office for an opinion on interpretation of this law. That's how anxious they were, and the legislature was, and Senator Birdwell was, to make sure that this thing got implemented. But they asked a lot of very specific questions. And one of the issues that was raised was, is it the president that has to be making these decisions? That's who's been delegated authority to make these choices and these decisions on the carrying of weapons with advice of the faculty senate, or the advice of the faculty, students, and staff. And the answer to that question was, you can't delegate that authority to a professor. Now, I don't know how this would play out if somebody, as this thing becomes operational, but there could be some problems there. So we've tried very, very hard to keep the faculty out of the line of fire, so to speak, to keep them from imposing their own rules. I'm not suggesting that it's wrong or that it shouldn't be done. It's just a course of action that we decided not to take within our system. But again, the legislature, keep in mind what happened here is that they passed this law, and they said, even though there's a provision in the Education Code which says that the President and the Board of Regents in particular has the authority to run and maintain the independence of its own institution using administrators and employees of the board's own choosing. But what the legislature has done is it's bypassed the Board of Regents, it's bypassed the Chancellor, it's gone directly to the presidents and said, you do this, you make sure you implement it, we're going to give you some guidance here, and then we're going to expect you to come back later on every 2 years, and you're going to tell us what you've got on the books and why, and explain it. They basically, in a manner of speaking, took the Board of Regents, the governing board, and the Chancellor out of the picture and retained a relationship with the university presidents. I find that, as a lawyer, remarkable that they would have done such a thing. There's a very deep passion right now, it seems to me, in the legislature about this issue, and they're going to watch it, and they're going to continue to watch it. So,
Meaning that presidents will come before a legislative committee every 2 years to discuss their plans, answer questions about their plans, potentially get criticized for their plans.
yeah, that's what they said, every 2 years.
I know a lot of these questions came up, Dr. Daniel, with the working group. It was a large, I want to say unwieldy, but I don't mean that in a disparaging way, just because you wanted to make sure you had representation from all of the campuses across the system, as well as the appropriate legal advice and governmental relations advice. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how hard that group worked, how much time you spent to come up with some agreed upon umbrella rules that all the institutions could follow?
Sure. We asked each of the 14 academic and health institutions to provide us with a committee representative, and it was typically, in fact, in all cases, the lead person on each campus. It was Stephen Good from UT Austin, for example, so that we could have conversations about the interpretation of the law. So we began with meetings every Friday for a couple hours, Friday afternoon in September, and met essentially every Friday over the phone for about 4 or 5 months and talked through the issues. It was a great group of people because we had law professors, we had criminology professors, we had chiefs of police, vice presidents for student affairs, vice presidents for business affairs, just a very rich and eclectic group of people. It turned out to be a very interesting intellectual exercise because imagine a room full of people addressing the question, what does it mean when the law says president shall establish reasonable rules taking into account the unique characteristic of their campus? Well, that could be interpreted over a great breadth, all the way from, well, presidents can do anything they think is reasonable, to, wait a minute, the law has some other language in it. Does that provide constraints? And by the way, shall we interpret strictly what the law says, or shall we try to infer legislative intent? And so I think it's safe to say that this wonderfully flexible language, presidents may establish reasonable rules taking into account the unique character of their institutions, gave the intended flexibility to campuses, but it also raised a lot of questions. What is reasonable? Also, the law said, however, presidents may not establish rules in such a way as to effectively ban the carrying of concealed handguns by license holders on the campus. Well, what does that mean? What is too far, so to speak? So it did turn out to be, for me at least, as a non-lawyer, a very interesting exercise. We got really important guidance from our Chancellor, Admiral retired William McRaven, who was outspoken against the law when or against the carrying of concealed handguns on the campus during the legislative process. But once the law was passed, he made it clear what our priorities were. One, we're going to follow the law. Number two, we're going to make our campuses as safe as we possibly can. And number three, we're going to try to do so in a way that permits our students, faculty, and staff to get on with their important work of learning, teaching, patient care, etc., with as little distraction as possible. And just to close out that discussion, among the consensus rules, if you will, that we came up with, for example, was a recommendation that presidents not allow concealed carry in laboratories with dangerous chemicals or biological agents, on the assumption that intentional or accidental discharge of a handgun by those who are not trained in that particular laboratory environment could cause great harm. Well, what about a building that has a classroom with no such chemicals, right next door to a laboratory with such chemicals, right next door to a classroom without, right next door to a laboratory with? So the law says that if you're not going to allow concealed carry, notification would typically involve a sign, and it's like a 3-foot high by 2-foot wide sign with very specific lettering in English and in Spanish. So I want you to imagine a hallway in an academic building where every other room is a laboratory that has a big sign on it saying concealed carry not allowed, and of course the reason is dangerous chemicals. But one would leave the casual observer with the impression that guns are everywhere if you see all these signs. And as we've heard, in fact, there are going to be very few handguns on campus possessed by those with a license. And so this actually sort of in our conversation fed into the look and feel of the campus. As much as possible, we did not want the campus to look and feel like something it wasn't. So as I said, it was a complex discussion, but in the end, it was each campus, considering its unique environment, and each president who will be making their rules.
Yeah, if I may just sort of take off from that. One of the key things Dr. Daniel mentioned there was, although presidents may make reasonable rules and regulations, they may not make rules and regulations that have the general effect of prohibiting campus carry. And for us at UT Austin, where that really became the biggest issue was deciding whether or not we could ban handguns from classrooms. And although we decided there were good reasons for doing that, that if we did ban handguns from classrooms, that would have the general effect of prohibiting campus carry, and so would violate the law. We actually devoted several thousand words in our report to explaining why we felt we could not recommend excluding handguns from classrooms. And that's been the flashpoint for much of the debate on our campus. And the sign problem is also another major flashpoint, because as Dr. Daniel indicated, for most places you have to post a sign, the language is stipulated in the law, and the size of the letters are stipulated in the law. They're large signs. And the legislature also passed a law that said if you put up a sign where it doesn't belong, someone can make a complaint with the Attorney General's office, and the university will be subject to a substantial fine on a daily basis. And in fact, if you go to our Attorney General's website, on the home page of the Attorney General's website, there's a box to click on to make a complaint about misplaced signs. And so that's another way in which the legislature and the courts will be watching everything that we do on these campuses.
When you talk about the unique characteristics of a campus, the layperson might not really grasp that. They might picture a UT Austin or a Texas State, when in fact we have institutions like UT MD Anderson cancer center and the UT system. I think we have 6 million hospital patient visits a year. So on the health side of the coin, this must have been very interesting in terms of there's dangerous chemicals, there's lots of situations with hospitals where you might not want guns.
Well, when we started our conversation, we sort of set up some basic parameters, and one of them was we would try to view our universities from a legal standpoint the way the law views the rest of the world. And indeed, Texas law prohibits the carrying of concealed handguns by licensed holders in licensed hospitals. And the statute referencing that licensing of hospitals actually does not apply to university hospitals, but we use the principle by analogy and extension. And our thought was, because the law prohibits concealed carry in licensed hospitals, by analogy and extension, we would prohibit concealed carry in our own hospitals. And we extended that to patient care areas for a variety of reasons, including the fact that many patients have to disrobe, for instance. So for our health institutions, a good fraction of the area is not available for concealed carry. And also their struggle was with mixed-use buildings. I would say for all of our campuses, that was the biggest problem. The kind of building I described earlier with a classroom and a laboratory and so forth. If you just have an administrative building with offices and so forth, that one's pretty easy. You're going to allow concealed carry. But when you've got a mix of offices and patient care areas, that's where it gets really difficult to decide what to do.
So I'd like to find out where we are, both at UT System and at Texas State, in the process right now. I know for UT System, UT Austin, and UT Arlington have both submitted their president's rules, and we're waiting for the other campuses. There were some rules that were sort of across the board, but in detail, these were all specific to the campuses. So what happens then, and then we'll talk about Texas State, where we are in the process.
Well, in the UT system, UT Austin, UT Arlington, and as of today, UT Southwestern Medical Center have had their rules established by their presidents. They don't go into effect until August 1, and boards of regents, by law, have the statutory ability to amend the president's rules, but it has to be by a vote of at least 2/3 of the members of the Board of Regents. So our Board of Regents will be reviewing the plans developed by campus presidents, and I expect 3 of the 14 institutions now have issued, the presidents have issued their plans, and I expect over the next few days, next several weeks, all of them would have been issued.
So the Board of Regents will hear the plans, don't necessarily have to approve them, but they could vote to amend them.
Correct. The law says that the Board of Regents have the opportunity to amend president's rules if they so choose, but it requires a 2/3 vote, which, back to Dr. Gomez's comment, is in of itself rather unusual.
Yeah. Well, that is very unusual to impose a supermajority, and what that says. What I take out of that is that they didn't want the boards making this decision. They wanted the presidents to make this decision, and they wanted the decision to come back from them, not from the Board of Regents. So the law that I talked about earlier that they really have violated their own statute in a sense, in that they've previously told the boards that you are to run these institutions and you are to run them with administrators of your own choosing. And of course, the boards have done that. I do want to comment on UT Austin's policy that Dr. Good has been so much a part of. I think it's a beautifully written, beautifully conceived, beautifully reasoned, and justified policy, and I think that obviously a great deal of thought went into that, and I think that it will probably be a sustainable policy, but they've gone and they've done what they thought was right and what they believed was right, and I have a feeling it's going to work out very well. what we did within the Texas state system, simply because of the diversity that we had also among the institutions, is we thought in terms not so much of location, but as Dr. Daniels points out, there are parts of the law in the penal code, in the health and safety code, and in other codes where the legislature has said, well, you can't have weapons near a school. You can't have within 1,500 feet. You can't have, you can't have them at any place where a governmental body is meeting. What's a governmental body? I know that the Court of Appeals meets on one of your campuses, maybe more than one. We have the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals meets on the Sam Houston campus. We looked not at location, but at event, and I think it got us pretty much to the same place. I don't think we went quite as far as UT Austin did, and I don't know what the other schools have done, but I do have to say that I'd be remiss if I didn't say I thought it's just a marvelous policy.
May I just add one other thing we did? Mostly attention was focused on these gun exclusion zones. And as Dr. Daniels said, there are a number of things already in existing Texas law that prohibits carrying. For example, our football games, our collegiate sporting events. And so we sort of drafted off those and tried to come up with analogous situations. But one thing we did at Texas is we also enacted a bunch of rules and regulations about how guns may be carried on campus, how these concealed handguns should be carried. And this sort of grew out of our research. We discovered among all the campuses in all the other states where they've had campus carry, there have been 4 accidental shootings. 2 occurred where someone actually took out the handgun and was showing it to someone else, and it accidentally discharged. That's already a violation of our criminal law because you're not allowed to display the handgun. If you display your handgun, that violates the law. It's got to be concealed. The other 2 were 2 instances in which someone was carrying a handgun loose in their pants pocket, including one Idaho State professor who literally shot himself in the foot during class when his handgun in his pocket went off. And so we said, if you're going to carry a handgun, it's got to be in a holster, and we prescribed regulations for what that holster has to be to make sure that guns would not fall out of it. It would have to cover the trigger area. We also said that anyone who carries a handgun must have it on or about their person at all times. So if you carry your gun in a backpack or in a handbag, you have to have that with you at all times. So if you're going to go to the gym and you carry your handgun in a backpack, you put it in a locker, you've just violated our rules. So days you go to the gym, you can't carry your handgun. And we think that's going to have a significant impact on safety. We were really concerned that people would put down their backpacks and they'd disappear. They'd forget it. Handguns would be lost. We considered putting gun lockers around campus for people to store their guns, and we decided that just would not be safe. And as far as I know, no other campus is doing that because everyone says that's not safe. So as Dr. Daniels said, our goals were to both follow the law and ensure maximum safety given the law that we had. And we consider those key components of what we've done because we think that given that we're going to have some of this, it needs to be done in the safest possible way.
We've talked a lot about faculty concerns, but were student voices involved in these in the process of coming up with the rules, and how were they able to make their voices heard?
Absolutely. We had 3 student members on our working group out of the 19. They were extremely valuable contributors. One of them was actually a concealed license carrier. We met with student groups. They reached out to student groups. As I said, we had these public forums. We took comments. And one of the big places where students came into play was the issue of dormitories. We came up with a recommendation that President Fenves adopted, which bans concealed carry in on-campus dormitory rooms. If people have them downstairs in a common area, that's okay. If a parent comes to help a student move in, they can concealed carry, but students can't take them back to their rooms. And the reason we did this is that we have almost no one who lives on campus who's 21 and over. So there's almost no one who has a license. We actually have a fair number of students that come who are under the age of 18. We had almost 300 of those this last semester. And we have almost no single rooms, so even if they stored their gun, they would not have sole access to it. On the other hand, we have some off-campus married student housing, and we said, there you can have guns. Those are older students. They have their own rooms, and so we thought that would be a reasonable compromise. But the student sentiment came into play very strongly there.
I want to make sure we have time for questions, but I would just like to hear from each of you briefly on what do you feel is the best possible outcome of the situation?
Well, for me, the best possible outcome is the law gets implemented and it quickly becomes a non-issue. People get about their work and things go on.
For me, the best possible outcome would be the law would be repealed, but I don't expect that's going to happen. And short of that, I agree absolutely with Dr. Daniel, and I actually anticipate that's what's going to happen.
And I would wholeheartedly agree with both of my esteemed colleagues here. I think we're in the business of education, and we need to get back to that business just as quickly as possible. And time will tell how this law turns out, whether it's a wise law or an unwise one, or one that simply is, has no real effect anyway. But at the end of the day, we just need to move on.
Thank you so much. We have some folks with microphones. If anyone has a question, raise your hand. We want to make sure we get you on mic.
Thank you. My name is Clyde Anderson. I have a question. First, I'd like to try to explain my feelings, is that I believe that the handgun, the campus carry, is for protection only. That nobody assumes that the reason somebody's going to take a handgun onto campus is to be aggressive with it. So it's for self-defense. Is that correct?
I think that's what the proponents of campus carry would say exactly.
That it's specifically for defensive purposes.
Correct.
Now, my other question, or the question following that, is there a policy on any of the campuses in the state where the staff is not allowed to carry a concealed weapon on campus? So I'm thinking if concealed carry on campus seems to be directed towards the student body, but does that have an equal application to the instructor specifically? Can an instructor that feels that if there's going to be concealed weapons in his classroom or her classroom, can they then choose to arm themselves? And is there a policy at any of the campuses that denies carrying handguns to the instructional staff?
I might pick up on part of that. So the rules are about place, not person. For example, a campus would logically establish rules that concealed carry would not be allowed in a child care center. And that rule is blind as to whether one is a student, staff, or faculty member. And essentially all the rules are about the place, not about the status of an individual. So they're written in that way. I'm not sure I understand your instructor question, but again, the rules are constructed with regard to place, a classroom, a laboratory, etc. And those rules would apply equally regardless to status. As Professor Good mentioned, For an individual faculty office, UT Austin rules would allow an individual through, for example, oral notification, not to permit concealed carry in that private office. That private office could be the office of a student, a staff member, or a faculty member, and the rule would apply equally to each, correct?
And of course, the result or whatever punishment would be forthcoming would be different for a student as opposed to a tenured faculty member, as opposed to an employee who serves at the pleasure of the institution. Keep in mind also that the Education Code and the Penal Code also prohibit other kinds of weapons than the weapons that are the subject of a concealed handgun license. For example, I know that switchblades and zip guns and, oh goodness, brass knuckles, shotguns, what have you, apply, are still in place. We can still, universities can still ban these weapons. One final word on open carry. There is no open carry on a public university campus. That's still the law. You cannot carry openly, even if you have a concealed handgun license. And so if anybody talks to you about the impact on open carry, or of open carry, there is none. It's just not allowed on a college campus.
Another question? I think we had a couple of other hands.
Yeah, hi, I'm Stephanie Blaisdell. I'm at the University of Memphis, and Tennessee has legislation that we think is going to pass that's similar to what's passed in Texas. I was curious, I'm in student affairs. I oversee offices like the Student Health Center, the Counseling Center, and Campus Recreation. I was wondering, does your exclusion of concealed carry in the hospital settings apply to campus health centers and counseling centers? And also, in terms of the campus recreation, it sounds like if you're, requiring a holster and other things, that you couldn't have a concealed carry in campus rec. But is that posted, or how are you handling that?
Well, in general, the way we talked about patient care, the question, what does that mean, patient care, if we're not going to allow concealed carry in patient care areas? And we, in our working group, defined it as patient care that involves a formal medical record of treatment of that individual. So I can't just come sit down and have a conversation with you and call it patient care. It needs to be a formal medical record. So that would carry over in some counseling centers, for example, if it's patient care with a formal medical record. Recreational centers are a different matter. Stephen, you might talk about how you handle that at Austin.
Sure. The major way we handled it, the recreational centers, was through this requirement that someone has to have the handgun on or about their person at all times. I suppose, not being a carrier myself, one could go to the gym and exercise with a holster on your back or something like that, but I suspect that wouldn't be too comfortable. And since your options are either having it on your person or not having it, it means if you're going to go to the rec center, you're not going to have it. So that's a way of certainly reducing the incidents in which you'd have a concealed carry in a student health center, a student rec center.
And if it were on your person, it would have to be concealed and not even imprinted correctly.
That's correct.
That would be difficult and work
That's
out
right.
here.
I had a question that related to visitors, off-campus visitors, particularly politicians who come to speak on campus. We've now seen in this presidential campaign that Mr. Trump, Senator Cruz, Governor Perry are all for concealed carry, but at their events, there are no guns allowed. They have metal detectors outside their events to make sure that nobody brings a gun to one of their campaign events. So if there were such speeches by outsiders, politicians or others, in auditoriums on campus, would guns be allowed, or would there be metal detectors to prevent guns?
Well, I might give the general answer. So the current law says that concealed carry is not allowed at collegiate sporting events. And again, by analogy and extension, I wouldn't be surprised if some campuses write rules that say concealed carry will not be allowed at large ticketed events. And they would say, by analogy to a football game, when you've got a lot of people together in an emotional setting, you're just not going to allow concealed carry. But that would be up to each individual campus to make that decision. But I would just say I would expect some presidents would write reasonable rules for their campus in which they would not allow concealed carry at a ticketed event. Stephen, how have you handled that at UT?
We did not make a special exception for ticketed events. There is another law, any place where there's alcohol sold and a certain percentage of the revenue is derived from the sale of the alcohol, also becomes a place where guns are not allowed. And so that's going to take up a lot of other sort of entertainment events that occur. We've got a multi-purpose facility, and lots of the groups that are coming in apparently are demanding that there be metal detectors to screen people. And I think the way we're going to deal with that is through this alcohol-related rule. Now, your question involves a politician coming in. Presumably there's not going to be the sale of alcohol at that kind of event. I would suspect in that kind of situation, the president, who has the power to amend the rules based on safety concerns, could easily make a one-time or an ad hoc rule for that kind of event to ensure the safety.